One of the most classic and important coasters in the theme park industry is Revolution at Six Flags Magic Mountain in Valencia, California. As I said, this ride is a classic and for good reason. This was the world's first modern-day inverting coaster with a vertical loop. Corkscrew at Knott's Berry Farm opened as the world's first modern-day inverting coaster, but that only had corkscrews. Another corkscrew, this one at Cedar Point, would feature a vertical loop, but it opened just after Revolution at Magic Mountain did in 1976. The point is, modern-day Revolution was the first coaster to feature a vertical loop. And one of the things that stands out about this ride is the build-up to that vertical loop. We'll get to this more later, but they really highlight this moment and frame it perfectly in the center of the park. Speaking of location, this is one of the first rides you'll see once you enter the park. After you take that right-hand turn, this and Tatsu are the first two rides you see, and it really gets you excited for your day, and this is one of the prettiest views in all of Six Flags Magic Mountain. It's a great introduction, and in some ways it feels right to enter a park that has so many modern thrill rides, but the first one you see is one of the old classics. I love it. This ride has an interesting history. It originally opened as Great American Revolution, and it kept that name up until 1980, so only 4 years. Then it was renamed to La Revolution from 1981 to 1987. A year later in 1988, this was renamed to Revolution. It kept this name all the way up until 2015. But in 2016, some big changes happened to Revolution. Firstly, they would change the name one more time, this time to New Revolution, and then there was a good change and a bad change. The good change was removing the over-the-shoulder restraints that had been in place since 1992. These were completely unnecessary, and it's operated with lap bars ever since, and it's been just fine. The bad change, though, was putting VR on it. This was optional, but it slowed down dispatches considerably and was a major headache. The headsets were taken off after 2 years, and I think that's a good change. The dispatches are a bit quicker now, and this ride doesn't need virtual reality. It's just fine as it is. And finally, for you movie fans out there, this coaster was featured in the 1977 film Roller Coaster. So what goes into riding this ride in 2024? Well, first of all, it isn't the busiest ride in the park. Many coasters will get longer lines. This shouldn't really be a surprise considering the fact that this is ultimately a family coaster. In my March 2024 visit, over the course of a few days, I never saw the line longer than 25 minutes. Now, the days we went weren't super busy, so there is definitely some importance to that. A summer Saturday would be a completely different story. I only saw Revolution running one train. I think they have two, but if I remember correctly, I only saw one in use during my visit. Perhaps this goes back to the item a moment ago about crowd levels. New Revolution has a seatbelt and a lap bar, and when you ride, you're going to need to put your stuff in bins on the opposite side of the station. You don't waste any time getting onto the lift hill. After a little right-hand turn, you ascend your lift. As you've probably guessed, this isn't the biggest ride out there. It does use the terrain very well, but its top height is only 113 feet. When you reach the top, you kind of level out a bit before having your first swooping drop, this one to the right. No real force, but it is a fun way to start the ride with a drop in the trees. You then have a few more similar type drops, swooping one way or the other in the woods. The second one takes place right next to the station and you feel a bit of speed. The third one happens shortly thereafter, twisting you up to the left to get you into position to go through the vertical loop. As I said, none of these drops really have that much force in the way of laterals and certainly not in the way of airtime, but I think it's a pretty fun way to start the ride with a few nice drops in the trees. Then you have an interesting decline into your vertical loop. I'm not even sure I really want to call this a drop. I think I'm going to call it a ramp. The ramp into the vertical loop is super shallow, but you do build up speed as you go along it. Actually, I'm guessing this is probably where you reach your top speed of 55 miles an hour, though because you're only going that speed for a very brief period of time, it doesn't really feel that fast. Then you have the moment on Revolution, the 90-foot tall vertical loop. As I alluded to, this moment and this view is iconic. Magic Mountain would not feel the same without it. As far as force goes, it is the most forceful moment on the ride with 4.9 G-forces, but it doesn't have a crazy amount of force for very long. It has just enough oomph to it to satisfy the adults and teenagers, but not too much to scare away kiddos riding their first inverting coaster. That's why this ride is perfect for that age demographic. Despite the drops at the beginning, this is definitely the best moment Revolution has to offer. Keep in mind, this is not supposed to be a very intense ride. Revolution does slow down from here, which is kind of funny because it was never super fast to begin with, but the second half is more mild than the first half. You start with a left-hand turn and then a right-hand turn that leads you into a tunnel. I always like when they put tunnels on roller coasters, and this one has some length to it. It's 144 feet long. Unfortunately, when you exit the tunnel, you do hit a trim brake and noticeably lose speed. This makes the finale pretty tame. You have a little dip to the right before rising up and having one last helix to the left before entering the brakes. Even with the trim brake, you're able to build up a little bit of speed towards the end of his helix before you enter that brake run. So, in general, Revolution feels like a pretty long coaster. It has 3,457 feet of track, and there are a bunch of slowdowns throughout the layout. Even though the changes in scenery don't actually make the ride longer, it does almost feel longer because you're looking at different parts of the park throughout the ride. It's pretty cool. A few of Magic Mountain's older coasters really use the terrain well, and that's awesome to see. So, how does Revolution stack up in terms of smoothness? This is kind of an interesting question to answer. So, the first question here, is Revolution rough? No, absolutely not. I think it's held up pretty well. However, there is kind of a side-to-side motion at some points with higher speeds. You might be able to see what I'm talking about here in the back row POV. I'm not exactly sure why this is the case. Is it the profiling? Is it how the trains run on the track? I'm not sure. It's not uncomfortable, but it is kind of an odd quirk. With over-the-shoulder restraints, this could potentially be uncomfortable, but as I said earlier, this ride no longer operates with over-the-shoulder restraints, so it's not a problem. For New Revolution's final score, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. This ride does a lot right. Actually, I'm not sure Revolution really does anything inherently wrong. As I alluded to earlier, this is a perfect coaster for kids getting their first inversion. It has just enough speed on those drops at the beginning, and the vertical loop has enough force to satisfy some older guests, but the younger guests will also really enjoy it for those elements. So how does it stack up to the rest of Six Flags Magic Mountain? Well, when you compare it to the other coasters in the park, there are a few things you have to do. One, you can't really compare it to the thrill rides. Twisted Colossus, Wonder Woman, and all the other big coasters are much better. Well, maybe not Viper, but that's a conversation for another day. You have to compare Revolution, though, to the park's family and kiddie coasters. In comparison to the kids coasters, it's much better than Roadrunner and the other three. In comparison to the family coasters, I also think it's a bit better than Gold Rusher and Ninja. Ninja does have the suspended coaster element, but the trains were a bit uncomfortable to me. Then, while I did enjoy Gold Rusher, I think Revolution offers just a bit more, and it's a bit more thrilling. So in general, yes, when you visit Magic Mountain, give New Revolution a ride, not only because of the history, but also because it's a really solid ride.